Hello?
Hey, Rich, it's Larson. You got a minute?
Sure, Larson. What's up?
Hey, and welcome to the Got a Minute podcast. I'm Larson Hicks, one of the hosts, and I'm here with my co-host, Pastor Rich Lust, down in Birmingham. What's up, Rich?
Yeah, great to be with you, Larson, as always.
Yeah, man. I'm broadcasting from an Airbnb in Moscow, Idaho this week. Here with the family for a little vacation / work trip. So it's a lovely place to be, except for the 1 week of the year when it is like 100 degrees and nobody has air conditioning. And we picked the week, so we're on a roll. I think our last podcast I was broadcasting from a camper in Monroe, Louisiana, where it was also unbelievably hot. So
you've been on the road a lot lately.
Yes. Well, and it seems like I'm bringing the heat with me wherever I go. So, look, I've been told I bring the heat.
Story of your life.
So, yeah, that's right.
Bringing the heat. That's right. Well, in my basement, it's about 68 degrees. So.
Oh man, rubbing it in. Well, I'm excited. We had a really fun podcast last week with Ron Dodson. Topic of that conversation was: is there a political solution? I think it kind of dabbles into some of this stuff that we're talking about here today. We've brought on Jason Farley. Jason is a lot of things. He's been a pastor at different times. He's been a silicone heating blanket manufacturer at one point. True. I know that because I was as well. We worked together during those years.
Held that factory down.
That's right. Jason is a writer, a poet, comedian. He's very heavily involved in Lore, the Christian, free market kind of Christian streaming platform. I'm probably butchering the pitch, but Jason's a man of many talents, kind of a Renaissance man. The purveyor of my favorite blog title of all time, the Westminster Confession of Funk, which I don't know, is that defunct now? Jason, is that on hold?
No, it is actually back again. And I wasn't going to use the name because David Shannon kept telling me it is confusing to people, which it doesn't bother me that it confuses. Yeah. But my new Substack podcast, which is on the mission of God for the family, is
cool.
I basically just am shoving it back out to all of the old Westminster Confession of Funk avenues, which never shut down. So you can still find it, but you can also find it on my Substack. And so I did a series on being religious, not spiritual. Awesome. And then now I'm doing it'll be a long series, about 50 episodes on the mission of God for the family. So
fantastic. And Jason's hailing from Spokane, Washington. I don't think I mentioned that yet either. So, I want to jump in
Spoke
here.
of Vegas is what we call it, but yeah.
Spoke Vegas. I've always called it Spokecompton.
Spokecompton, yeah, that's a common one.
Yeah. It's definitely feeling those vibes.
Holds the record for the most episodes of the TV show Cops filmed in my hometown. So, yeah,
wow.
we continue to hold.
You guys can get a billboard.
Well, they announced that Cops is coming back on the air, and immediately everyone in Spokane was like, "Hey, they're coming back." They hadn't announced they were filming here, but everybody assumed they were coming back, and then they announced the dates when they were filming here. So yes, I love my hometown.
That's awesome. Well, I'll tell you, one of the most pleasant surprises of this trip so far. We just got in yesterday. We landed around dinner time, and we were trying to figure out where we were going to go to dinner before we drove down to Moscow. And I was like, man, I wish Gordy's was still around, because Gordy's was our favorite place. And I pulled it up, and it's open. I thought somehow I heard a rumor that it was closed. And so
that rumor was there. They had considered closing during COVID, but so many people showed up to get takeout that they actually ended up surviving. They had said, I think we're going to have to close. And everybody said, nope.
Dude, Gordy's Szechuan, if you're ever in Spokane, definitely go to Gordy's Szechuan. It's a lovely little establishment that serves just punches way out of its weight class. I mean, just for being, a small little dive kind of joint in the South Hill and in in Spokane, Washington. It's like just really outstanding, world class Szechuan.
I believe it has 13 seats in the little thing.
They've expanded. They've expanded into like the space next to them, so they had a whole other dining room. So it's
dojo. The dojo shut down.
Taking over the dojo. So pretty exciting.
Makes sense. They are Chinese food.
That's right. Well, we'll use that as our segue to talk about White Boy Summer. Speaking of ethnicity, our friend here, Jason, published an article on his Substack, jasonfarley.substack.com, on the topic of White Boy Summer. And it's a topic that's come up a lot in our circles recently. And I was really happy to see my friend Jason talking about it, because I knew it was going to be balanced and thoughtful and compassionate and wise. And so, and you delivered on all of those things. So thank you for writing it. First of all, it was shared in my network, and I saw several other people refer to it. We'd love to hear you talk more about it. Just kind of what prompted it, I guess, in the first place for you. Why did you decide you had to write this article? Yeah,
well, so I went to a Nick Fuentes rally. That's what
did you?
I really did, yeah. Wow. And I was once a young dude, a punk rock kid, down with the man, upset at the world. How come they don't give us a chance? And I see that kind of echoing in this group of young men, and got a chance I was in a town where a Nick Fuentes rally was going, and had a secret golden ticket. And so it's like, there's no way I'm missing this, and went to it, stayed through the whole thing, and realized that if I wasn't already on an FBI watch list, I now am. And, it's, but brought my friend and CEO and we brought a box of cigars, and afterwards, just in the hallway, said, anybody that will come and sit and talk with us, we got cigars. And we handed out cigars to these young men and sat and smoked cigars and talked for a couple of hours afterwards. And just wanted to hear, why are you here? What are you getting out of this? Right? What brings you here? How'd you discover Nick Fuentes? And do you count yourself a groyper, or are you just checking it out? And had a really great multi-hour conversation. There was one guy that got up, he came over, grabbed a cigar, and he said, and I said, hey, so, what brings you here? And he said, I hate fags and want them to all die. And everybody started saying fed, and they chased him away.
That's awesome.
It was really funny.
That's awesome.
But as I was talking to these,
I feel about most of these White Boy Summer guys, by the way. I'm always like, are you fed?
Are you fed? Yeah. But actually sitting there talking with them, a lot of them just said, look, I grew up without a dad. I didn't have a dad. I was in my basement watching porn, playing video games, and then came across Nick Fuentes, Jordan Peterson, came across these guys, and now I have a purpose for my life. Wow. They've taught me what it is to have pride, and what it is to try and find a wife, what it is to start a family. And as I talked with them, realized that this is a group of young men that the church is not effectively reaching. That the church is not effectively hearing, understanding, welcoming, and a lot of them they either had never gone to church before, but they had started going to church either because of Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson was a much more influential name for most of these guys. They'd started going to church because of Jordan Peterson. Wow. They'd stopped watching porn because of Jordan Peterson, and so I really this age group, I was them, and a couple of older men in in a downtown church reached out to me and were really patient and worked through all of my angst with me. I had highlighter yellow dyed hair that was shaved in the back, and I grew it down over the front of my face before I could grow a beard. And they were they loved me, were patient with me, and spoke the truth to me, right? And so I see the young dudes now out there and think, I want to make sure that they don't get just ignored, shoved aside, but that there is somebody that is still speaking the truth to them. And so I've had this conversation. What I ended up writing, I've had that conversation with a lot of guys, right? We've have a number of young guys in our church that I'm having these conversations with, and so I was trying to write out the what I see in White Boy Summer and divide out, hopefully fairly and cheerfully, the things about it that really aren't problematic, but that do upset some boomers. But that's just generation gap stuff, and the fact that boomers took a huge cash withdrawal out of the economy that they to retire on, and it was directly out of the accounts of Gen Z, Gen Alpha to come, the millennial accounts. They withdrew cash in exchange. They cashed in their wealth for cash, ran off with it, and now it's destroyed the economy. And so you've got this, and so now when people are upset at the boomers, and sometimes the boomers don't get it because they just don't want to get it. They don't want to hear that. And so there is some of that's upsetting people, and it's really not a problem what they're saying. But then there are a series of assumptions that are being brought in the back through the back door that really are problematic, and that really do have home destroying levels of error embedded in them that are being brought in the back door, usually unknowingly by the young Christian guys. So I wanted to try and divide out those two things and say, here's what to look out for, right? The sunglasses are not the problem, even though people get annoyed at the sunglasses. And I remember what it was like to wear bell bottoms, ironically, because it was funny and because the adults were annoyed. Like, I remember the joy of my dad rolling his eyes. So to be able to say, yeah, I get that, but look out for the evolution that is being peddled under a different name. Look out for the metaphysical and cosmological tripe that's being sold in the some of these White Boy Summer tacos.
For sure.
Jason, what do you think White Boy Summer is trying to accomplish? I mean, is this just guys having fun on social media posting memes? Or is this supposed to be a political movement that would actually, change the world somehow and push back against, say, institutionalized anti-white racism? Is it, fatherless and disconnected young men looking for a place to belong and sort of a father figure or a mentor? I mean, what do you think it is? What's driving?
I mean, my take is that most of it is a response to kind of a black pilling, like, I'm giving up on the traditional means of getting anything done. In a lot of ways, it's similar to like the CBGB's New York DIY punk rock scene. They've given up on they've given up on broader culture ever caring, and so they're going to go do their own thing and not care. Right? They're being there are a lot of people out there accusing people of being racist just because you're white, right? You are whether you are trying to or not, there's no way to avoid being racist, right? You hear that voice long enough, and the temptation is to say, fine then, right? I don't care what any of the normal avenues think anymore. And in fact, I'm going to prove it by seeing, how many times I can get kicked off of Twitter, how many times I can get suspended. That's I think it's the equivalent of the the Ramones, putting, like, you had all that series of early 80s punk where every single album that came out had somebody flipping off the world.
Right.
It was just it was a badge of honor to not be allowed in Hastings. It was a badge of honor to get the sleeve put on your album.
Right.
The same sort of way, early hip hop got sued for inappropriate, what's the little thing say, explicit language. Man, what was the band that got sued? They had to put the explicit language stickers on everything, but they made more money selling T-shirts with that explicit language sticker on it than they did with their album.
Probably
in a lot of ways, I think that's what's going on. It's that same sort of impulse that, but the difference is now the culture is race obsessed, and so you've got this pressure building, and so they're trying to respond. But the difficulty is a race obsessed culture responding in a race obsessed looking way ends up playing into the hand that you're being, you're trying to play the hand you're being dealt, rather than where the church has traditionally refused to play some of these games. That's how the church has responded, sometimes well and sometimes poorly, but
those are really good thoughts. And I want to pick up on your black pill metaphor there in just a minute, but something else that I thought about as you were talking about that I think is helpful. It's kind of a fighting fire with fire kind of thing. It's like, well, they're doing their racial identity politics, so we're going to do ours. And I think that for Christians, that doesn't work well. I would even say more generally for conservatives, it doesn't work well, because if there's anything that's obvious in our culture, it's that there is a double standard. And so people on the right cannot do or get away with what people on the left do. I mean, all you have to do is look at how the BLM riots were handled versus the J6, thing. You're just never going to get the same treatment. So to think that a black identity politics can be matched by white identity politics, to me, just doesn't seem to be realistic. But I think that's a lot of what this is it's an identity politics movement of some sort. I'll say this: if it is just guys having fun on the internet with clever memes, I don't really care. I might think some are funny or some not. I don't really care. But if this is something that guys are really building an identity around, or thinking, they're thinking, oh, this is how we're going to make a difference. Or this is our pushback, politically, socially, culturally. I do think it's a real problem. And I think part of it is it's a problem because you've got men who are doing something that's very effeminate, which is thinking of themselves primarily in victimhood terms.
Yeah.
Like everybody's out to get us. Now, there's a grain of truth to that. Before we started recording, I mentioned I've been reading this book, The Unprotected Class by Jeremy Carl, which I found to be a very good book, very, very informative. And basically what Carl argues is that the only kind of institutionalized systemic racism that's really left in our culture is anti-white racism. So there really is a problem. There is something that I think, these guys are responding to that's real. Having open borders and letting just anybody come into our country and take the jobs and take the welfare benefits and drive up the prices of houses and groceries and everything else. I mean, those are real significant problems. And I think we do need to face those. But I think whining about it in any kind of way, which is what I'm not saying that's what all of this is, but that's what some of it strikes me as. Whining about it is not going to help. I don't think a white identity politics movement is going to help either. In fact, one thing I've appreciated about Carl's book is that he doesn't really go that direction with it. Like, one thing that he points out is that, you see all of these big corporations, whether it's the tech corporations, the media corporations, the entertainment corporations, they'll put these things out, or even like airlines saying we want 50% of our pilots in the next training round to be women and minorities, or Disney saying we've got this position and we're not going to hire a white person, or Biden saying I'm going to appoint a Supreme Court justice and it has to be a black woman. All of that's illegal. All of that is illegal because it is race-based discrimination, even though it goes in the other direction than what was happening when the civil rights legislation first came through. And I think part of what Carl would say to do is, well, it's illegal, so fight it through legal channels and see if you can win. And there have been some pretty high-profile cases where a white person did experience racial discrimination and did win. So it can happen. This, however dead you think the Constitution is, it's not totally dead. There's still pockets where, at least to some degree, it works, and so you can avail yourself of that. But even if it's an uphill climb for young white men today, if white men have been villainized, their masculinity is toxic, their skin color means that they're intrinsically racist and sort of the bad guys of history, the villains of history. I think that thinking of yourself as a victim is a really unhealthy kind of thing. And so I think insofar as this is that, I think it's a real problem. Right. I just think that's something that I've seen this kind of bleed over into a bit. And I think that's very problematic. But I want to go back to something I said a minute ago about the identity politics, because I think that's really where the issue is. I would say the bane of America, of American culture and politics for a long, long time now has been identity politics. And I think in a lot of ways it started with the rise of feminism, which sort of separated out women from their households and treated women as an identity group with their own distinctive interests apart from men or apart from their households. And that's a huge problem. I mean, I remember, trying to get this point across to my kids when they were growing up, and I would, at the dinner, it's kind of a dinner table type discussion. And I would say, look, is there any law that they could pass, down in Montgomery or up in Washington, D.C.? Is there any law that they could pass that would be good for your mom and bad for me, or vice versa? And my kids were like, no, I don't think so, because if it's bad, if it's bad for her, it's going to be bad for you both, because, you're one. It's like it's going to be bad for the whole family. I'm like, yes, exactly. So you can't think of so you can't play the identity politics game. That doesn't work. But at this point, all American politics is identity politics. I mean, the entire Democratic Party it's this cobbled together coalition of different identity groups. I mean, LGBTQ, of course, is all about identity politics built around sexual preferences or orientations, whatever the particular perversion is. And same kind of thing with things like BLM and so forth. It's all it's just various forms of identity politics. And I think for us to say, well, what we need to do then is play a white identity politics, to me, I think that's just a disaster. There's got to be a better way. And I think that's what we need to do, is find it and help these young men find it.
Well, and in some ways, I think because we tried to solve the race problem with laws, we inflamed the sin, right? An attempt to sanctify the country by means of the law, I think inflamed this sin, right? So because this is something that's been bubbling for a long time, right? It's possible to see now because of the internet, but it's been going on a long time. And I think you're right that to say, well, it worked for them, so we better do it back. If we don't hit back, what's going to happen? The reason I think it worked for them was because we made it possible by means of trying to pass laws to make people less racist, right? Like that's just not how sanctification works. Right. So, I mean, one of the things that I have been thinking about is, if let's say it is all true, and I think books like the one you just mentioned are making the case that white racism is now acceptable, right? It's acceptable. We're being metaphorically pushed into the back of the bus, right? Let's say that's all completely true. It's hard to imagine, because such a big country, it's hard to get accurate statistics that are going to reflect any particular person's experience, because you're dealing with a huge country, and so depending on where you are, it's going to be different. But let's say you're in a situation, you're in a place where it's all true. The church's response has been to teach young men to roll over, right? And that hasn't been good, right? So John tells us that the strength, that the virtue of young men is their strength, right? That's and we haven't been teaching them what does it look like if you're in this situation. I think the church has for a long time just said, well, come on, it's not that bad, or hey, this is what happens when the SBC used to be okay with slavery, or whatever it is. We've just rolled over rather than tried to really help young men use their strength well. And so what I've been thinking is, if it's all true and we're getting pushed to the back of the bus, as Christians, our primary response should begin by saying, we're going to turn the back of the bus into a party that everybody wants to be in, right? To respond joyfully, say, oh yeah, okay, apparently, being white is now a disadvantage. And that's going to be a bummer for y'all, because you're now all going to miss out on what the joy of what it is to have a Christian feast, of have a Christian festival. Right. You're going to miss out on our tables. You're going to miss out on being having us there, because we're going to be the most joyful, the least bitter, the people that love their families the best, that are best. We're the ones that bring muffins to the neighbors regularly. We're going to be the ones that bake cookies for everyone, right? To really just say, you guys think you don't want us, but I'm going to prove you wrong. That mentality that says, oh, you're an enemy, I know what to do with an enemy. We love enemies, right?
Yeah.
Rather than deny the enemy, deny that we've got enemies. I think we haven't. I think the church has been really weak in some of these areas, and the young men are the ones that end up with all the strength that they don't know how to use, because they're disconnected from previous generations that are supposed to be there with the wisdom to help them use the strength well. So I think a lot of this is just a breakdown in church culture. And that's not something that you fix overnight, but I think it's something that we ought to say, yes, let's fix this. Let's have a place for celebration. Let's have a place to, invite the neighbors. And
yeah. So I think, just to kind of summarize or restate some of what you've said, Jason, and some of what you said in the article, there's that Martin Luther King, I think, quote that a riot is the language of the unheard. I think I learned that I think we probably both learned that from Rage Against the Machine.
Right. Yep.
But yeah, I think you're talking about a group of men, young men who feel unheard, feel attacked. You mentioned that they're fatherless, as kind of almost to a man. I mean, it's most of the folks that you talk to that are in this have kind of a fatherlessness, whether actual or significant absence. And the thing that I've lamented is that part of this culture is sort of, because it's identity politics. It's mostly it's defining yourself as part of a group, and the group is definitely a young group. It doesn't include older men. It's white boy summer, and it's so it seems like the cap is somewhere around 40. To be like, that's as old as you could really be to be a part of this group. And there's a Michael Foster posted something a couple weeks ago that I thought was great. I won't read the whole thing here, but I'll read just a little snippet. He posted this on social media. Do you want to be a mature man, the sort of man who isn't tossed to and fro like a clueless, unfathered son? This requires a pastor, a spiritual father who will shepherd and discipline you to help you grow in holy wisdom. It is God's design. That is how he orders his house. And he ends there's a lot more to it. He goes through a lot of scripture, but then he finishes it by saying, the formula is simple. Find a church that will disciple you, submit yourself to it, and grow up. So this was, I think he was doing kind of 30 days of fatherhood, this thing that he does every summer, I think in June. But I thought he was spot on, and it reminded me a lot of these guys, and I think they found a community. They found fathers on the internet, guys like Jordan Peterson. Rich and I think our very first podcast was talking about Jordan Peterson's letter to the Christian church,
one of the first
was
ones,
great.
yeah.
I mean, he was basically, it's interesting because this all predates the White Boy Summer stuff, but I feel like he was talking about exactly what we're all talking about. There's this group of guys that need the church or something like the church. And so his call was for older, wiser men to please welcome these guys in, because there's going to be trouble if we don't. My concern, just as somebody who's, all of us here are in sort of leadership positions in our churches, respectively. I'm really interested in the thing I loved about your article, Jason, was that I felt like it had a very pastoral tone. I felt like you were not giving a hot take, which is sort of the only language. I mean, I said a riot is the language of the unheard. I feel like memes are sort of like the modern, like Twitter battles. Memes are sort of the modern way to protest. And you can't fight fire with fire. Like, you can't just enter into this universe where that's how you communicate and that's how ideas come across. You have to try to grab them by the shoulders and shake them and look them in the eyes and go, hey, wake up, But I guess from a pastoral standpoint, at some point, I think about Titus chapter 3, verses 9 through 11, which says, but avoid foolish controversies, genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. As for a person who stirs up division, after warning him once and then twice, have nothing more to do with him, knowing that such a person is warped and sinful, he is self-condemned. It's interesting that he specifically mentions genealogies, these kind of worthless. He's calling all of it unprofitable and worthless. The quarrels about the law, these genealogies, these foolish controversies. So at some point, as a church, it's like, if we've got these guys in our midst, we need to kind of sternly talk to them, try to lead them. But there is a point at which Paul tells us you gotta cut them loose, and I'll throw into that bundle of ideas or questions or comments this not to like overly psychologize this, but there's a sense where it's like guys who never received a spanking, from a loving father are like desperately asking for one. They're like, how much of a racket can I make before somebody will come do something about me? Will straighten me out. Like, I think there's almost a little bit of that in there, but maybe I'm being a little reading too much into it.
I don't know, Rich, what are your thoughts?
Well, I wanted to go back to something you said and kind of talk about the big picture for just a minute, because this is part of it that fascinates me. I'm not a boomer, I'm Gen X, which we always get skipped over in all the discussions about generations. But but I can say now I've lived long enough to see America go through a very clearly defined progression in terms of how it understands race. So when I was growing up, and I grew up, in various places, moved around a lot, finally settled down in Chicago, which is where I had, I guess you could say my most formative years, in the sense of like my, junior high and high school years, and then moved to the South, and then out to Texas, and now back to the South. And now I'm in Birmingham, which of course was kind of ground zero for a lot of the, the racial stuff that happened in the 1960s. But it's interesting to me, like growing up in the 1980s and into the 1990s, it was like, what we were told is that you need to be like the goal. And it was Martin Luther King's goal. Don't judge a man by the color of his skin, judge him by his character. And I think in a lot of ways, you talked about how America tried to attain sanctification by the law. And I think there's an element of truth in that, which may be why things have ultimately degenerated to where they are, that the civil rights legislation that was passed was not ultimately the right way to deal with it. But however much blame or credit you put on the civil rights legislation, and I think, for example, Christopher Caldwell has done a good example, has given some good examples or illustrations of ways in which the civil rights legislation has kind of gone off the rails and has really replaced the Constitution, and has kind of created the identity politics and victimhood culture that we're really in now. Still, I can say growing up in the 1980s and 1990s, I think in general, race relations in America were good, not perfect, of course. Nothing's ever perfect. But, we were told you're supposed to be colorblind. And I think in a lot of ways we had attained that. What I heard Jeremy Carl say this, and it really struck me as true, because he's probably about the same age I am. He's probably Gen X as well. Like in the 1980s, Michael Jordan was the most famous athlete. Michael Jackson was the most famous entertainer or singer, and Eddie Murphy was the biggest movie star. All black men. And nobody thought anything of that. Nobody begrudged them for their success. Nobody protested the fact that these, black men are having such incredible success. I remember it's kind of cliche, but, black friends. Just not thinking a whole lot, not being really all that race conscious, in a social way. And I think I think there are a lot of people who were very similar in how they looked at things. Now, maybe you still had some older people who still had some of that sort of built-in racial prejudice they had grown up with. But I can say I grew up largely in a colorblind, society where equal opportunity was seen as a worthy goal. You did not judge people on the basis or pigeonhole people on the basis of their skin color. You really did seek to judge them according to the character. And I think that lasted for at least a little bit of time. And I think you saw it like with some black athletes who were very appreciative of the fact that they had opportunities that previous generations did not. And they didn't go around with a chip on their shoulder, but they were grateful, and they appreciated the fact that they lived in a society where they could have this kind of success and attain to this kind of wealth. And I think there were a lot of good things about that. But I think in the early 2000s, and then especially, ironically, when Obama got elected, race relations in America tanked. And we went from being colorblind in a healthy sense to being, by the time Obama's 2 terms were finished, extremely race conscious. And the media narrative was that, we've never actually made any progress about race, and America is still an evil, racist country. And the Republican Party wants to put all blacks back into chains. And conservatives, of course, are inherently racist. And, anytime there was a shooting that involved a white and a black, if say a white police officer shoots a black or something, there's so many of these cases where this happened, it immediately became a national story, and it drove the narrative for weeks on end. And of course, you kind of get in the post-Obama era into Trump, and you get these massive riots anytime something like that happens. And it's like, wow, it seems like we're in a worse place than we were in 1965 in terms of race relations. Like, it's just utterly hopeless. And I think that was very deliberate. I think there was a very deliberate attempt to divide Americans on the basis of race. Americans. So I'm not saying that that Marxism is to blame for all of this, because
I'll say it.
Well, Joshua Mitchell makes an interesting case that identity politics is distinct from Marxism, and he says it's identity politics, it's not Marxism. I don't think there is airtight. I don't think they can be distinguished in such an airtight kind of way. I think it's really both. But I do think it's clear that in America, we were so prosperous that you were not going to divide Americans on the basis of class the way you would in classical Marxism.
Yeah.
So I think Marxists were looking at a way to how do you pick at this and create division, the kind of division we need to create revolution.
Yeah.
And I think they found a fault line with race. And, again, at just the time that it seemed, I won't say America was a racial paradise or anything, but at just the time that it seemed like we were really moving beyond race into a society where, that partiality was being greatly diminished. And we had a society that was largely what MLK's famous line envisioned: don't judge a man by his skin color, but by his character. You have these cultural Marxists who come in and who make race everything once again. And the media, of course, picks up on that. All the progressives pick up on that, and that becomes the thing. And Obama, I think, had an opportunity to be like the final chapter of racial healing in America. And instead, Obama decides to create more racial division than we had had in a long, long time. And of course, Michelle Obama as well. Michelle Obama gets up and says, basically, you white people have always been running from us, always trying to get away from us, and just kind of stokes that racial division. And I think what the White Boy Summer guys need to understand is what progressives and revolutionaries want more than anything is racial division in America. And so if you decide to play that critical race theory game, that identity politics game, I've heard Doug Wilson say, don't take the bait. I would say you're taking the bait. Yeah. And you're actually falling into the trap they've set. You're actually, by dividing along racial lines in this kind of way, you're actually doing exactly what the left wants you to do.
I think what Jason said, I mean, but before you weigh in, Jason, I'll just set this up for you. You please riff on all of it. But I feel like the point Jason was trying to make is these guys need a positive vision of the church, of the future of their role in society. And I think that's where we are falling short, as a church. We're just falling short to inspire these guys. At least on the internet with White Boy Summer, these guys are being told where they can fight. It's like, hey, we'll take that strength you've got, we'll put you to work, start cranking out the memes, and it's like, cool, I'll put on these stupid glasses and I'll start making memes, and I know it's working because I'm getting lots of comments and lots of people are pissed off. I must be doing a great job,
The algorithm is rewarding it.
The algorithm's rewarding.
That's the problem with social media, obviously, in our society. So one thing about that. So I had a conversation with a guy a while back. And it's not a guy in my church, not even a guy here locally, but a guy that was into something, or at least tempted by the White Boy Summer stuff to kind of go down that path. And as we talked about it, it was kind of a victimhood thing. Whites are discriminated against. Where white males get passed over for job opportunities, even if we're the most qualified. You got these quotas, so there's got to be a certain number of women and minorities included in everything, and so a lot of white men are not getting opportunities they used to. And so if your vision of the world is, as a man, I should be able to go out and if I work hard, I can build a career and I can support my family on one income, so my wife can be a homemaker and raise her children, and that's the life I want to live. And now you find that that's much, much harder. What I said to this guy is, I said it may be a lot harder. And I said, the reality is, that just means you've got to work harder. If the obstacles in your path are greater, then you've got to rise to the occasion to overcome them. And I'm sorry if that's your situation, but the reality is most generations have some kind of hardship they have to deal with. And maybe, like everybody likes to pick on the boomers. Okay, well, the boomers did, there's, after the U.S. won World War II and Europe was in shambles, there was no question that America was going to establish itself as the economic superpower and have all kinds of advantages in the post-war generation. And we can talk about all the ways in which the boomers messed things up. But the reality is, I don't think the fact that they enjoyed that kind of prosperity was their fault. I think it was just providential circumstances that put them there. That's not the norm. That is not the norm. Most generations have to deal with a depression or a war or a famine or a pandemic. Most generations have to deal with something really, really hard. Sometimes generations have to deal with multiple tragedies like that. And you just rise to the occasion and you work hard and you overcome and you build a life for yourself. And maybe it won't be as prosperous as a previous generation, but who cares? Maybe it won't be exactly what you envisioned, but whose life ever is exactly what they envisioned? Just get to work and do the best you can with what you've got where you are. And so, as this guy pushed back and said, "Well, I just don't think you understand how hard it is." I was like, "Well, no. I mean, actually, I've got a son and I've got sons-in-law. I mean, I can see some of the challenges men are up against today." But I said, "Look, what do you think a black father, say a black Christian father, would have told his son in 1950 about what it's going to take to make it in the world? Think about what that father would say to his son. And if you feel like you're on the receiving end now of the mirror image of that kind of discrimination, whatever that father would have said to his son, you take that same counsel and you put it in practice in your life. Because I can tell you that a Christian father in that situation would have said, yeah, the life's unfair. There's all kinds of injustices in the world. And if you're on the receiving end of it, you got to figure out how to deal with that and deal with it as a Christian. And which means you got to grow up, you got to have thicker skin, and you got to get to work.
I completely agree with the conclusion. Here is one thing about and I'm the same way, where I've got a son and a daughter who's about to get married, and so having these conversations. And one of the major differences is the boomers lived in a one-income economy, but they're the ones who added a second income to the home with all of the moms adding to the workforce. But they lived their whole life in a one-income economy on two incomes, and they passed on a two-income economy. And so that and I think we can be honest about the difference, and still have the same advice at the end of the day, and say and work on building a vision that says, and what I want to do is pass a one income economy to a later generation, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I think the bigger vision of helping men understand that you can actually make sacrifices now in such a way that your life is transferable to the next generation. You can leave the world in a better position, but you can't do it on identity politics. You can't do it with Marxist assumptions. You can't do it with the assumptions of Charles Darwin. That doesn't pass on a better world to your kids and to your grandkids. And I have one of my favorite sci-fi writers, Walter M. Martin Jr., who he's most famous for A Canticle for Leibowitz, which is a post-apocalyptic, trying to rebuilding the world after apocalypse. But he had a series of short stories, and he has one about the terraforming of Mars. It's an incredible short story, and it's about these men that go up and they think that they're going to they're going to get paid to do this work. They're going to get to terraform Mars and then go back home, and other people will get to go up and live there. But what happens is the world living on Mars with the gravity and the different air pressure and having to breathe through machines ends up destroying all of their bodies. Right. And so they go up to Mars, they terraform it, and then when it's time to go home, they actually can't survive on Earth, and so they all have to stay. And it's the story is about the psychological, the different responses psychologically to having your life destroyed. But the ones that survive and are able to smile at the end of the day are the ones that can imagine all of the families and their descendants that are going to get to live better lives because they gave theirs up. And that's what identity politics exists. And the reason that I would say it is Marxism, like I get that that historic Marxism, created by that old drunk Karl, that he envisioned a world where the rich and the poor are at war with one another, and we envision instead different divisions of the world, but everybody on the Marxist side agrees that the world has a limited number of resources and that life is a fight, like life is a rivalry for those resources. And however you divide it up and turn it into a war for those resources doesn't really matter at the end of the day. You're not dealing with a Trinitarian cosmology anymore, right? You're not dealing with a Trinitarian creational ethic that says God created the kind of world where the harder you work, the more resources you have. The harder you work, the more expansive the resources are for the next generation. That you and that if you work hard, it doesn't just bless you; it blesses everyone around you because resources overflow in this creation, and your life is not just yours because the harder you work, you actually expand. Your life expands into a gift that you can give around, and you end up with more of it. Other people end up with more of it, and that vision for an expansive resource system that God has built into the world, I think isn't being passed on, isn't being taught, maybe even. So the black pilling, I think, comes because they say there's a limited number of resources, and those folks have an advantage, right? We need some Booker T. Washington that comes in and says, yeah, but their shoes still need shining, right? Let's build an empire on shoe shining.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. I mean, when we're not playing a zero sum game when it comes to economics, you really can grow. The world really can grow in wealth as God's people are faithful and as we seek to fulfill the creation mandate. Yeah, absolutely. And I would agree with you. I mean, I think Marxism is the cancer that has infected so much in our culture. Again, I don't think Marxism and identity politics are really all that separable because, like, I think of feminism as just Marxism applied to the sexes. Critical race theory is just Marxism applied to race relations. But that's my whole point is that if we decide to play that game too, if we decide to do a white identity politics, then we've fallen into that same Marxist trap. I want to go back to what you said, that you see the white boy summer guys as kind of black pilled. And I know we use that, the pill metaphor, so you've got the white pill, which is, those are the things that sort of make you optimistic and think, there can be this bright future. You've got the blue pill where you kind of insulate yourself from reality and live in this fantasy world. You've got the red pill where you're basically, no, like reality has hard edges to it. Sometimes the truth hurts, but we need to be willing to embrace it. And then you got the black pill where it's like you got red pilled without any white pills. And so now you've just given up because it seems like reality is arrayed against you. And I think you can sort of put people in our culture in these different, you can kind of tell which kind of pills they're swallowing. And and I would say as Christians, we need a heavy dose of red pills, so we're in touch with reality. We also need a heavy dose of white pills because, hey, it's God's world and we believe God's kingdom is going to grow. But I think there is a real tendency, like I've seen a lot of guys that I think got, I'll say, red pilled, whether it was about the sexes or some other issue. They got red pilled, in the say between 2010 and 2020. And then in the last, 4 or 5 years have really gone black pill because the things that they hoped would work for them have not, or the kind of life they envisioned for themselves has not ever materialized. Right. And I do think that's a real problem. And I do think that things like White Boy Summer I think it's the kind of thing, there's a lot of things that are like this. White Boy Summer is just one example, but I think it does kind of appeal to those people, those guys who feel like I can never win. I can never succeed in this world. Again, it's that kind of victim mentality. One thing that you said in your essay that I think is worth unpacking some is you've got a line in there where you say, next, remember, there is no such thing as white culture. Your enemy made that up to gain leverage over you. And then you say, I have more in common with the black family that lives across the street from me than a white dude in New Jersey or Louisiana. Culture is an abstraction. From what I have observed, the current use is almost always the anthropological use, the defining of groups by their visible differences from me. That use was, by design, an othering. It was a way to separate people, to diagnose their position on the evolutionary tree. I'm unconvinced that we can separate that use from its mythology. Maybe we can, but it's being used by the woke left and their guilt manipulation tactics to great effect. Two things about that paragraph that I'd like for us to talk about. One is there's no such thing as white culture. What does that mean? And then the thing at the very end of it where you talk about the guilt manipulation. And I think we should talk about white guilt and all that kind of thing. But no such thing as white culture. What do you mean by that? Do whites not have a culture?
Well, I think that white as a category is a misnomer, because when you want to start talking about culture, what you're talking about is collective desires, right? The abstraction of collective desires. So a group of people that like the same things, value the same things, right, and have a similar sort of position, or maybe they all lean into particular things in a particular way, right? So I grew up in the Northwest, inland Northwest, Spokane, Washington, Rocky Mountains, and the all of the people that live, I live on the corner in a little neighborhood, and 6 of my 8 neighbors are Christians. So Sunday morning we wave, we're heading off to different churches, Baptists and Presbyterians and evangelicals and Roman Catholics. But it's an incredibly peaceful little neighborhood. For that reason, we had somebody break into one of the houses on the corner, and I got a text message in the late evening. Somebody's breaking into so-and-so's house, and because we're all on a little text chain, and all of the men from the neighborhood show up at the door, and this guy that's broken in, he's a teenage kid, his eyes are just plates, because all of a sudden he's got all of these men saying, what the hell are you doing? This is not your house. And they said, and he says, no, I live here. And like, no, we know who lives here. This is our neighborhood. What are you doing here? Right? Nobody. And after that, so after that, the one guy that has the gun on his hip, who's standing there, and it's like, no, you don't live here. We know who lives here. So you're done. So after he leaves, then we call the cops, but the cops aren't going to get there in time. And this is our neighborhood, right? So we've got this great neighborhood. And as I think through, you've got like in terms of descent, you've got Northern European, Southern European, you've got an Asian, Filipino guy, you've got a black family, you've got, but when it comes down to it, we have a really pleasant little culture, right, in our neighborhood, and everybody pretends to barbecue, but we don't know how to barbecue. We're from the Northwest. We're not from Texas or Kansas City or the South.
We'll show you.
Yeah, we don't have good barbecue. We make incredible burgers, but we put like avocados on them, right? Because we're West Coasters, right? We do weird things, and I go out in the morning, head out for church, and somebody will shout, "He is risen," and you hear 3 or 4, "He is risen indeed," right? It's an amazing little neighborhood. Those folks I have a lot in common with food, with language, with assumptions, right? And when I hang out with my friends from the South, they think about food different. They think about race relations different, honestly, than somebody from the Northwest, right? They have a history of racial animosity in their area that we don't have up here. It doesn't come up around here. If I have a good friend from Minnesota, and he's like, no, he's from Minneapolis, and he's like, race is a huge issue for us because of the history of the race relations. I was like, how do we just don't have that. I have a good friend from New Jersey, and when I'm over on the East Coast and we hang out, and he talks to me about what it's like living in New Jersey, and he's like, oh man, so you like drive your car every day? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, every day we drive our car. And he's like, man, we drive our car when we're leaving the state. Like, other than that, we ride public transportation, right? But everybody in his neighborhood does. So the culture is an abstracted view of a group of people's shared desires and assumptions. That isn't something that you can say about whites, whites as a group. If somebody from France, and somebody from Belgium, and myself, we're not going to have the same set of assumptions and collected desires. So, but if you're trying to create a set of rivalries, you have to have identifiable markers, because you can't go up and say, hey, do you have mustard based barbecue sauce, or do you have brown sugar based barbecue sauce, or do you dry rub, right? That takes too long. You're not going to build up any sort of significant rivalry that way. You have to have identifiable markers. Well, the identifiable markers that we're handed down are from Carl Linnaeus. He's the one that invented the color system, and what he was doing. You have the French philosophers that were called the encyclopedists, Diderot being the main one that did it, where he took theology and he moved it to a subset of philosophy, right? So he moved the knowledge of God into a subset of other human questions about big issues, metaphysics, whatever. And then at the same time, Carl Linnaeus was taking the biology of man and putting man onto the animal kingdom tree in the evolutionary spectrum, over with apes, right? Over with the monkeys. We're over here, and then he divided the human race up into their subcategories, and he did it by color, right? You have black, you have white, you have yellow, and red, right? This is what you originally had. Although red may have been added later. I'm trying to remember. White, black, yellow were there for sure, and so you have this sort of thinking about mankind as where he is as an animal, and then subspecies of different human beings. Well, moving them onto the spectrum of the animals was a revolutionary move, right? That's not the way Christians think about people. People are made in the image of God. We're above the animals. We're not on the same the descendiary tree, or however you want to put it, right? Noah brought the animals onto the ark, and his family weren't some of the animals being brought onto the ark, right? We're not animals. That's just it. But if we are, then you can have subspecies. You can have it makes all of the different ways of thinking about we're going to have a master race within the human races. Which one is the most far evolved, right? You have now all these discussions about which of the anthropoids did different races come from, and are we actually the same species? Those sorts of discussions. That is all in a particular view of how you divide up the human race into subcategories that comes from a mythological understanding that we reject as Christians. So you have the fact that you're trying to say that there's this big, broad culture, over here that we all hold to, because of that either it comes out of our DNA, which is how some people put it, or it is passed down to us through our genealogy. You've got some sort of culture that way. And then on top of that, it's a division of the human race that is anti-biblical, right? Is in opposition to the scriptures. We don't think that way. So I can't remember if I even answered your question. But you pulled the string, and there's a snake in my boot came out. So
yeah. Well, you was talking about white culture, and I think you did respond to that. And the second part was just guilt manipulation tactics.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because, and I think this is where the rubber hits the road, is when they divide us up into rivalries. There's a really great lecture. It's from the early 60s, and it's a gentleman that got a hold of the one of the American communist handbooks that they were using as they went around to establish communist groups at universities. And he was just opening it up, and he was reading, and it was explaining the tactics, the tactics of division that you would use in order to gather enough people to your group to be able to then leverage or coerce the whole. Like, you didn't have to have everybody, but if you could get a big enough group and then put leverage in at the right spots, you could actually coerce the whole population into actions that the majority didn't want. And it was explaining how to do that. And a big part of that had to do with using labels that the book said had the smell of sin, right? If you could just attach the smell of sin through labeling groups, then you would be able to get in there and leverage those groups to do things that they didn't want to do, because you were effectively leveraging them with guilt, and they didn't have to actually be guilty of it if you could attach the label that smelled like guilt, right? It's really a brilliant, evil, demonic Machiavellianism the term that they said that they had found the most useful was the term fascist, right? That they would accuse anyone that disagreed with them of fascism, and that fascism, if they could make them just smell like a fascist, then people would do everything they could to prove that they weren't. Which
I'm sure explains the origin of the term Christian nationalism. I mean, it's how do we give that smell to Christians?
Yeah. Well, they started by and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, because they started with the term white nationalist, right?
Right.
Everything was white nationalist this, white nationalist that, and then one day it just switched to Christian nationalist in place of white, right? And so they were able to first attach the smell of sin to the word white,
right?
Right, and that was effectively done. I mean, it was actually, I think, effectively done. And some of that is they were able to take the real sins of actual people without significant melanin in their skin. The cops in LA that were doing terrible things, for example, or cops in Minneapolis from the 70s, that were making lines and arresting anybody that came across them that wasn't that was the wrong skin color, those sorts of things, real things like that actually happened. They were able to take those things and attach guilt to the term white everywhere else in the country, right? And some of this, you had the effective use of West Coast rap to do this. You had the effective use of different artistic movements and movies. You have early Black cinema, you don't really have these sorts of themes. But once you hit, the mid 90s, Black cinema suddenly takes on this kind of theme. And so you have a consistent use of the term white that attaches the smell of guilt to it. And then when you want to disenfranchise Christians, you can take the term white, replace it with the term Christian, and keep the smell, right? And that's what they're attempting to do. Well, you've got now a generation that has seen this play, that sees the play and refuses to play along. And that's the positive side of the White Boy Summer, that says we're not playing that game. right? That's the positive reaction. You want to make me feel bad for being white? No. Right.
Well, and I think about this all makes me think about Rene Girard, Jason, because I feel like his whole thing is how there's this mechanism that has existed since the beginning of time, this mimetic contagion where essentially it's a kind of envy motivates people and creates tension, and that tension starts to build to an extent that there needs to be some release. And so you pick a victim, you kill the victim, you put all your sins on the victim. Somehow you go, hey, it was that witch, that was the problem. Let's kill the witch. Or it was that prophet. Let's go kill that prophet. He was the troublemaker. And it worked. I think Gerard's point is that it works if you don't know what's happening, if you don't actually understand the mechanism. But what happened with Christ was that Christ kind of pulled the veil off of what was happening. And he was actually an innocent victim. And it sort of reveals the fact that usually these victims are innocent of everything they're being accused of. Christ was perfectly innocent, and he was vindicated by God. But this mechanism stops losing its efficacy when you start thinking, wait, is this just another? Are we doing the scapegoating thing? And so I think what's good about White Boy Summer. It's taken us a long time to get to what's good about it. I mean, we've talked a little bit about it, but I think what's good is they're calling it out. You know, they're seeing the play that's being run at some level. They're pointing to it. The problem that I think we're all agreeing in here is that instead of transcending it, right, with a ecclesiocentric vision of the universe, you know, with a positive vision of Christ's church and how it's going to change the face of the world, they're just entering into a different iteration of the same thing.
Yeah, if the response to being made the scapegoat is you're not going to make me the scapegoat, I'm going to make you the scapegoat, right? Then you haven't escaped the system.
Right. You haven't transcended it. Yeah.
And I think I do think that in a lot of ways, what the place that Marxism has been able to gain its footing in America is where we don't know what to do with our guilt. Anytime they discover a place where we don't know what to do with our shame, we don't know what to do with our guilt, they're able to get a lever in that spot. So in the SBC, we've seen that they were able to get in a lever anywhere where there was evidence of the SBC not opposing slavery, because there is an active shame about those things in the past.
Right.
We should be teaching people what to do with their shame, right? You take that to Jesus, who died on the cross for your shame, and he was stripped naked and he died naked because he was wearing your shame. And then if they try to use your shame against you, you say, sorry, that shame's gone. I'm gonna obey what Jesus says to do. There's no leverage point because the shame has been taken by Christ. And the same with our guilt, right? Jesus was declared guilty and crucified in our behalf. Even though he was innocent, he wore our guilt, or he received our guilt. He became guilt on the cross. And so if they come and try to use our guilt, let's say your dad was a slave. Let's say you were a slave owner, right? And they come and try to use the guilt and say, well, you were a slave owner. Don't you feel terrible about yourself? Now you need to, walk across this image of you need to step on this Bible, or else, we're going to tell everybody you used to be a slave owner.
Right.
We should immediately say, if I sinned in that way that you're saying, then Christ has taken it on the cross. You can't leverage my guilt against me because my guilt already leveraged Christ up onto the cross, right? Yeah. So there's the guilt and the shame should be dealt with at the cross, not by any sort of systematic attempt to make things right.
Right.
And
Right.
But unfortunately, American Christianity has been trying to leverage people's guilt into sanctification now for more generations than we can remember, right? Instead of preaching the gospel the way, and a lot of people, their experience of growing up in church was the guilt, the guilt, the guilt, the shame, the shame,
Well, I think
the
you made a
attempt
really
to control.
I think you made a really profound point, Jason, about politics earlier as well, and I think it ties in here that a massive mistake we've made in American politics is dealing with our guilt via politics, via laws, the Civil Rights Act in this particular case, and so it seems that our age, and I don't know if this has always been the case, or if it's more pronounced now, but we seem to be politics obsessed, and anybody who wants to talk about social problems, the first place they go is politics. It's like that's the only answer that anybody's like. Whatever the answer is, it's going to have political. It's going to politics is going to be part of the solution, probably. And I think that was the point of this conversation Rich and I had last week, asking that question: is there a political solution? And I think the answer is ultimately no. I mean, it's our politics itself needs to be saved. Our politics will be transformed, but it's not going. It's going to be because of the restoration of all things through Christ, through Christ's salvation, of individuals, of cultures, of communities, of nations, and I think that's the place where people are being manipulated by their guilt. They're being that feels uncomfortable. I need to fight fire with fire somehow. Politics is kind of the answer. So let's craft a political framework, to talk about a positive vision of Christian nationalism. And that I just think that starts going in weird places. And it's kind of like on several levels, I think about answering a fool according to his folly, like just that whole idea that I think these guys are answering a fool according to his folly when they shouldn't. And then I think as people in roles of these slightly older guys to these guys in the church, I think our response, we have to think about answering a fool according to his folly as well. Where do we engage with the arguments here, and where do we go, this is stupid, and don't and sort of not,
Yeah.
So
I think the guilt issue is huge. If I can kind of step back and do the big picture again, the big picture thing again here, this is kind of how I see it. I think that as Western culture has secularized, we're not returning to pagan. Apostatizing is different. Being an apostate Christian is different than being a pagan. Apostate Christians still have a deep nagging sense of guilt. They know that something is wrong. There's still that sense of guilt there, but they don't know what to do with it because they've rejected the gospel. So they've rejected the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ to cover our sins and to that's where our righteousness is found. And so they don't have a way of dealing with their guilt. And so I would say the whole progressive movement, the whole wokeness thing is all about trying to resolve guilt. And the way it's trying to resolve guilt is basically by either finding a scapegoat or scapegoating yourself. And so what you see in Europe and in the US right now with you got to ask the question, why are these nations in Europe just suiciding themselves? They're offing themselves by allowing, Muslims and other immigrants just to come in and basically have the run of the place. We're seeing the same kind of thing happen in America. It's not just being a borderless nation, but it's tearing down all the statues that represented our heritage and all, everything we hear about is how, America's never been great. America's always been this terrible racist nation and all that. And so you got to ask the question, what kind of people does this to themselves? Like, what kind of people would destroy their own culture, their own civilization, especially when you consider it's been the most successful civilization in the history of the world? Why
Right.
would you go and just destroy that and give all of its treasures and its wealth and its resources away, and basically cut yourself off from any kind of future that you could have, and your children from any kind of future they could have? And I think it's guilt. I think it's an attempt to atone. And so, because we are a racist nation, the way we're going to eradicate our racism is by letting darker skinned people overrun our nation and not have any borders. It's that kind of thing. That's not the only manifestation of it, but that's the kind of thing that's happening. And of course, that doesn't take away the guilt. But I think it's what drives people to do that kind of thing. So I think one thing we've got to develop is an understanding of not just individual justification, but what you might call a doctrine of social justification. So individual justification by faith, but also social or cultural or civilizational justification by faith, where a whole society can basically deal with its guilt by looking to Jesus. And of course, by keeping Jesus out of the public square, we end up with no way to deal with our public guilt and our public shame. And so we keep looking for these ways to eradicate them that don't work. So I think that's a huge issue here. And I think that's one that's not going to go away. And I think when I say there's no political solution, that's a huge part of what I mean, is that a lot of what is driving the way people act today is they're trying to deal with unresolved guilt, and they're trying to deal with unresolved shame. And you just can't do that on your own. You can't do that any other way. So I think that's a huge part of it. Wokeness is an attempt to do that. I think the other thing is, and I mentioned this before we went live, there's a little Ryan Long skit, and I don't recommend Ryan Long because he's not clean at all, but this one was kind of funny, and it made the rounds a few years ago, where he's got the woke guy and the racist guy, and they basically end up saying the exact same thing.
Right.
Because they're both playing the same game of identity politics. So it's kind of, it's like the woke guy says, you've got white privilege. And the racist guy says, well, yes, it is a privilege to be white. And I'm proud of that privilege. I'm not going to grovel because of that privilege. I'm going to boast about it. Yes, we are better than you. And that's the kind of thing that I think to some degree, White Boy Summer, to the degree that it's kind of a humorous thing and it's kind of about having fun. I think that's really what it is. It's like, we actually do have a heritage worthy of being celebrated. Like, it was interesting in reading Carl's book. He talks about the environmental movement going woke and the environmental movement becoming more about dealing with race issues than actually about caring for the environment. And he said, and so like he quotes somebody who basically says, it's these white people who, with all their industrialization, they're the ones who created all this pollution. And so you're blaming white people because the inventor of the light bulb, was a white guy. But nobody would credit whites and say, well, actually, white people did make life better for everybody by their inventions and the technology they developed. And actually, that's actually made life better for a lot of people who aren't white. That never gets said. The only thing that gets said is, you guys industrialized things, and through your technology, you created all these environmental issues, and now darker skinned people are suffering because of you. So it's kind of this double bind situation where there's no way for you to win, no matter what you do.
Rich,
and
what do you mean
I see
by
White Boy Summer as a rejection of all of that. And that's that's a good thing, to reject all of that. It needs to be rejected because it's nonsense. It's crazy. It's insane. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was going to ask, have you thought about articulating social justification or society, a society being justified? Like, how could you flesh that out further? Is that?
Yeah. Well, Jason may want to say something about it.
Yeah. Go ahead.
But I'm happy to address it.
Well, yeah, it's actually something that I've been ringing the bell of. Corporate justification is by faith and not by works for years now. And everybody just rolls their eyes at me until recently. All of a sudden, people are like, oh, yeah, okay, which has been really encouraging because I think the American church we're so individualistic by assumption that we don't see corporate realities, right? They're invisible to us. That doesn't mean they're not there. It just means that in the church, we try to justify our corporate man by works and not by faith. So rather than by looking to Jesus corporately, we end up coming up with some other marker of our justification than faith. And so I think it's encouraging to hear somebody else talk about it.
Yeah. So, and I've preached on it not too long ago. Actually, I try to from time to time because I do think it's such a huge issue. I think we have to understand that the need for justification, like the need for glorification, is a need that is built into all humans. We all have the need for approval, to be accepted, to be welcomed, to be vindicated, to be declared in the right. So that's not just a question that Christians concern themselves with. It's a universal human need and impulse. I actually was just reading something today, and I don't know if I can find this quickly enough, but I did think it was really interesting. And this is not strictly about social justification, but I thought it made the point really well. It's put out by the Ruth Institute, who does. I think there are a lot of Roman Catholics involved in the Ruth Institute, but they're conservative Christians who basically their ministry is to call people out of LGBTQ lifestyles. Okay. And so in their email that came out today, they talk about this girl, Nancy, who when she was about 6 years old, she got abused by her cousin. And that really, the sexual abuse confused her. And later in her life, she falls into a lesbian lifestyle, which is very common for somebody to go through some kind of abusive sexual experience. And then the way that manifests itself is in, some kind of perverse sexuality. But, the cousin said, "Oh, this is love. And so you can't tell anybody." And so Nancy protected him and kept the secret. Of course, other people do eventually find out about it. And she was just riddled with guilt and felt like she was such a bad person, she could never be loved. And so it goes on to tell the story how in third grade, she developed a same-sex attraction towards a teacher who reminded her of her mom. She wanted her mom's approval, her mom's acceptance. She felt like she could never have it because of this abuse that had happened to her. So she tries to find some other female who can be sort of a surrogate mother. And so, I mean, she goes into detail here that I won't repeat. But basically, she says, let me see if I can find the quote because I thought it was really, really telling. She says, "My mom was very loving, but in my eyes, I wasn't good enough for her. My whole life became a mission to be someone that everyone could see was good enough." Okay. That's that built-in desire for justification, to be good enough, to be declared in the right. What happened to Nancy at an individual level is what happens to whole societies at a corporate level. It's really interesting. I mentioned Joshua Mitchell already, and I was hearing him talk about this, and he was talking about in the aftermath of World War II, all of the guilt, of course, especially Germany, all the guilt that you had in Germany, and basically the desire for the European Union, and basically, which really what the European Union is about, is abolishing nationhood, because the idea was nations and national ties and national loyalties, to have a particular loyalty to a particular people is what creates rivalry, and therefore it creates war. And we've had these world wars. We don't want to have them again. So we're just going to try to abolish nationhood and abolish loyalty to nation. And so the whole idea of the European Union was basically to dissolve all European identities into this very generic, bland, identity where all particularity is done away with. But it was really driven by guilt. It was all about social guilt. It was about trying to deal with that guilt and make atonement and find justification in the aftermath of World War II. And that's what. So you can see how their political actions were driven by a desire for justification. In America, you've got the same kind of thing. The guilt built up from race-based chattel slavery, and then Jim Crow laws and the lynching, all that kind of all this guilt built up. And then of course you pile on top of that the guilt of the sexual revolution and fornication and no-fault divorce and murdering 60 million babies. You pile up all that guilt. Well, how are you going to deal with it? We got this massive pile of guilt. Where's it going to go? How are we going to deal with it? And again, I think you can really better understand what progressivism and wokeness is all about is if you see it as an attempt at and it is an attempt at justification by works. I mean, it is a false gospel, but it's really a Christian heresy, because it's a pursuit of justification, a Christian end, but by very different means.
That's such a profound thought, guys. I feel like that's something that needs to be dwelt on further. Just this idea that White Boy Summer, and you can fill in the blank with 1,000 other things, but White Boy Summer is an attempt at justification of whiteness through works. It's a desire to claim, to justify whiteness and to deal with the guilt of that stains those who are white in America because of what bad white Americans have done in the past. To overcome it through vigorous arguments, it's claiming victim status and then clinging to the good works of white people, of white cultures.
Well, and I think there's truth in that. I think what they get right is that, of course, it's not a sin to be white. That's what they get. That's
yeah.
And I think, I mean, it's weird to say that, but I mean, in a way, you do have to say it's not a sin to be white. So and one other example of this, I think one of the, I hate to even mention his name, mentioning Donald Trump is kind of like mentioning Hitler. It's like, at that point you kind of lose your audience because everybody has their thoughts about it. But one thing that I find very interesting about Donald Trump is that and I'm not saying this is a good thing because, he made the claim at one point of never done anything that needed to be forgiven. Okay. But one thing that I think is appealing to him, that is appealing about him to a lot of people, is the fact that he's not paralyzed by guilt. Now, he may have a false righteousness. It may still be very much a self-justification. But you compare that to Biden, who does all the politically correct and progressive groveling that you're supposed to do. He says all the appropriate things about how terrible white people are and how terrible America. I mean, you cannot have two more diametrically opposed visions of America, where in the view of the left, it's like America is this, horrible place, horrible nation, filled with racism throughout its whole history. It's never been great. And then you've got Donald Trump, who says, not only am I, as a white man, sinless, and so I reject all of your accusations against me, but America has been great in the past, and I want to make it great again. I want to, I'm justified, and I want to justify America. I think that's appealing to a lot of people. Now, it may not appeal for the right reasons. And again, I think there's lots of problems with the way Trump puts it, but I think the fact that he has been able to deflect the accusations thrown at him is something people find very appealing, because nobody else in our culture really does that. Yeah. Christians should be able to do it,
right?
But oftentimes we should.
When an accusation, and this is where I think, oh man, I've got two things I want to say that so help me remember that I've got another one. But one of the things that's great about Girard is his commentary on Job, when he talks about refusing, that one of the best way to reveal the scapegoating mechanism is to refuse to be scapegoated when you're innocent. And he uses the book of Job to show that Job's refusal to take on the guilt that's being put on him when he's innocent ends up revealing the scapegoat mechanism. And that's what I think Trump is doing. All right.
Yes. It's all in Girard, as they say.
It is.
I got that in the back of my mind. Yeah. Absolutely.
I don't think Trump is as innocent as Job.
No, he's not.
I know that might be.
That's why I say there's a problem with it. But I think he's doing the same thing. And he's not guilty of a lot of the things he has been accused of.
Right. So by refusing to take on, and so he refuses to take on the false accusations and take them seriously. Right. And he just says, that's not true. That's not true. Right. And so long as it continues to be not true, then that's the right thing to do. If something is true, the right thing to do with it is to say, okay, Jesus died for that sin. Right. And he's the scapegoat. Right. And that's so Jesus's death and resurrection, or Jesus' death on the cross in particular, is the great revelatory moment of the scapegoating mechanism. And a scapegoat outside of us that is innocent, that welcomes the scapegoating, is what makes it possible to have the destruction of rivalry in a Christian culture, right? Because that sin is still there, but everyone says, but the scapegoat over there took it, and he volunteered to take it, and he has told us over and over that he wants to take it, and he's not claiming to be guilty to take it. He's saying, yes, I'm innocent and I'll take it. That's the great revelation of the scapegoating mechanism and what makes true community possible.
Yeah.
Well, something that I know I've heard several people talking about Gerard and Gerard himself talk about is like how much more virulent these different ideologies become when they become aware of the scapegoating of that mechanism of victim of scapegoating and victim, the power. So in a Christianized world, in a world post Christ that is aware of victimhood and believes being a victim is abusing a victim is bad, or killing a victim for sins they're not guilty of is bad. You now have this weird race to be a victim, as a weird move to gain power and influence. It's like you can get things done by claiming victim status, and I think that's a little bit of what White Boy Summer is about. Is it's going ahead and claiming that victim status, and in a effort to because that's a lever that works in this world that we live in today. That's a play that works. Trump's been benefiting from. You opened the Trump box, Rich.
I did. I knew I shouldn't have.
But it's true. I mean, he's been benefiting from all the trials. It's like, I mean, we've seen how incredibly well his campaign has gone ever since they tried to string him up. And it's like, well, there you go. Jason, did you say your second thing?
Oh no, I didn't. Thank you for remembering. So here's the other, I think, important part of corporate justification is corporate justification only works in covenantal categories, and whiteness is not a covenantal category.
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's why if some random dude in Virginia owned slaves and and let's say he is actually guilty of that, I have no connection to him because of the color of my skin, because whiteness, skin color, is not a covenantal category. If my grandfather worshipped idols, that's a category that even the 10 Commandments say it's still going to continue affecting me, because there's a direct covenantal reality in my life connected to his life. Whereas if he loved the Lord, then to 1,000 generations, there's blessings in that real covenantal category. The cities are covenantal categories. Tribes are covenantal categories. Family is covenantal category. Churches are covenantal categories. States, they're civic covenantal categories. But race is not one of them. And so,
you're saying, are you saying anything that has a covenant head, that has a recognized covenant head?
It doesn't have to be necessarily recognized, but that is a real covenant relationship. So, my kids there's a real covenantal relationship, and language groups are real in the Bible, but they're not covenant groups, covenantally bound groups. But it's anything that you are a citizen of by nature of birth.
Well, here's another way to get at what you're talking about. And I actually wrote an article several years back, which, Larson, maybe we should in our show notes put a link to Jason's article on White Boy Summer and maybe this article of mine from a few years back. And the name of my article is the Bible colorblind? And I start off asking the question, suppose you did not know that humans came in different skin colors. Could you figure out that fact just from reading the Bible? In other words, does skin color ever enter into the Bible's way of dealing with humanity? And there's a few references here and there, like Jeremiah 13 talks about the Ethiopian. The book of Song of Solomon talks about the dark skin of the beloved. You got a tiny handful of places. Maybe Miriam, when her skin gets turned white because she doesn't like the fact that Moses took a black wife, an Ethiopian wife. There's a few places, but I mean, overall, the Bible pays absolutely no attention to skin color. Now, the Bible talks a lot about different ethnicities, tribal groupings, obviously. Really the kind of things you just mentioned, but it never categorizes people according to skin color.
Right.
And actually, what you find in the Bible is that while nations do have defined identities, so they are covenantal entities in that way, they're also permeable. And this is true even of Israel. So, I mean, if there was any nation that you would think, oh, it's got to maintain blood purity, it would be Israel, right? Because they're going to bring the Messiah into the world. But when Israel comes out of Egypt, they come out with a mixed multitude that over the course of their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, that mixed multitude made up of a wide variety of Gentiles, including probably some Egyptians, but also a lot of other types of people. They just get incorporated into the people of Israel. So even the covenant nation had permeable boundaries when it came to ethnicity, blood, skin color, whatever however you want to describe those kind of biological type categories. That I think is hugely significant. So actually, in my essay, Is the Bible Colorblind? I make some of the same points you do. I don't think of myself as belonging to a body of people that share my skin color. And the reason for that is that, you know what, there's lots of white people with whom I have virtually nothing in common because maybe we speak a different language, we live in a different nation, we don't share the same worldview, the same religion, any of the same customs. It doesn't make any sense to just talk about white people in general, even within America. I remember Stephen Wolfe got a lot of attention, and I might have talked about this when we talked with Ron Dotson, Larson. I can't remember. If I did, you can tell me to stop. But Stephen Wolfe, so I'm probably repeating myself here, but Stephen Wolfe had the tweet where he said, something like, and this is a paraphrase, but something like white evangelicals are America's last hope. Basically it's up to white evangelicals to stop what's happening to our culture and reverse it. And I thought, well, I could grant that. If we grant the people that the white evangelicals are trying to save America from are the white progressives. It's just like whites are on both sides of this. So it just cancels out. I mean, basically, you're just talking about evangelicals versus progressives, like Christians against non-Christians. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And you can leave the skin color part out of it because it's not really relevant.
Can you guys help me think about this in relation to unconverted Jewish people? Because that's a people group that people in the White Boy Summer movement seem to have a lot of animosity towards. So covenantal justification, how does that play in to this to how Christians should be thinking about the Jews?
I prefer Los Jews. That's how I
Los Jews.
It's all yours.
Well, so my question, when guys who are in the alt-right or dissident right, whatever you want to call it, start to spout anything that sounds anti-Semitic. I mean, there's two things that really come to mind. One is, I think there's envy. It's kind of a reverse of we're supposed to, as the church, provoke the Jewish people to envy by our faithfulness, by the fact that it's obvious we've received the blessings that were promised in the Old Covenant to Israel. So when the church receives those blessings, that's supposed to provoke the Jews to jealousy. When I hear these guys talk about the Jews, a lot of times I think it's just out of envy, the fact that the Jewish people, even in their unbelief, are more successful. I mean, as Doug Wilson says, they're a high performance people. And I think that's true. Now, sometimes they excel at really bad things. They excel at evil, in Hollywood and politics. A lot of times that's what it is. But they can also excel in really good ways in music and art and medicine and so forth. So they tend to be high performing at whatever they choose to do. The other thing I would say is, like, what's the point? Like if you're, when, like, a lot of times you'll hear people say, oh yeah, so Jews run Hollywood, they run the pornography industry, there's a bunch of Jews on Biden's cabinet. And my question always is, well, yes, that is interesting to notice that these Jews have made it to the top of their field in many cases. But why do you identify them that way? Why do you identify them by their ethnicity as opposed to, say, their ideology? Why do you focus on the fact that they're ethnic Jews as opposed to the fact that they are worldview progressives? Like, if you just told me progressives run Hollywood and progressives, I mean, what's the gain or loss there?
Formerly religious progressives.
So my question is always, so just say you're right and the Jews run all these things. What do you want to do with that information? Am I supposed to have some special hatred for Jews because of that? Am I supposed to wish that Hitler killed more of them? I mean, what am I supposed to do with that information that you're giving me about the Jews? Why does it matter that they're Jews? And I've never gotten a good answer to that question because I don't think there really is one.
Jason,
okay, we did talk about this, Ron Dodson, because Ron, I don't remember this on the podcast or outside of it, but Ron made the point. He said, if you had, if 3/4 of the cabinet members, say Biden's cabinet members were Chinese, like we'd all, pay attention to that fact. And I'd say, yeah, that would be odd for sure. Especially because Chinese people don't have quite the same history in America as Jews do. But also what I'd want to know is, what's their worldview? I mean, are these Christian Chinese? I mean, obviously not if they're serving in Biden's cabinet, but I mean, it's like, at the end of the day, I mean, that's like, what do these people think and what are they going to do? That's what matters to me. And the fact that they share this ethnicity, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. It's not, there's no obvious cash value.
I mean, that's another high performance people. I mean, it's a funny choice because the races in America, the races, the skin tones or whatever ethnicities that have the most are the most successful in America right now are Asians and Indians, I believe, in terms of like wealth and education. They're crushing it. So I would fully expect that a president's cabinet would be stacked with Asians and Indians in another couple of generations, because there is some cultural momentum that'd be interesting to try to parse it out. But there's clearly some high performance cultural heritage. I think I've heard Malcolm Gladwell talk about Chinese rice paddies versus European crops and try to trace it to that. It's interesting. But yeah, the Jew thing, I mean, at least one thing it reveals to me is a continued obliviousness to this mimetic contagion, and the fact that they're both claiming victim status and also scapegoating other people groups. And so there's at least a blindness to that mechanism.
Now, let's say somebody said, well, the problem with having these Jews on the cabinet is that they influence American foreign policy, so it doesn't serve the best interest of the American people. It does what's best for Israel. Now we've got an issue we can talk about.
Right.
Okay. Now there's an issue where I'd say, yes, that is a problem. Okay. And if that's what we're, then that is an issue and we need to address it.
And that's what I was going to bring up too.
Yeah.
Is that I think, so depending on what it is, the question what we should be talking about when we're talking is loyalty, right? Where are the loyalties of this person, exactly, or loyalties of that person? And if you have covenant loyalties to a different covenant than the covenant that we're in, then that's when you start to have problems. But that's a covenant question, and there's something you can actually do about it when you run into it, right? So if you run into somebody whose covenant loyalties are not to the covenants that you share with them, then you can say, okay, we have an issue. You're a Chinese person on the cabinet, and you're serving the Chinese government from a position of influence. There's a really great book called Blacklisted by History that is about Senator McCarthy and the McCarthy trials. and the actual USSR spies that he identified. And when the Berlin Wall fell and we got access, or they published the Verona papers, which was all the papers of the Russian spies, and seeing how many people he got that he truly identified as a spy, and how far, you had people in the president's cabinet room that were spies for the Russians, right? Their loyalties were someplace else. And so you've got, a speechwriter who was getting things that they wanted in the president's speeches wired to them. And the Verona papers, we can now go back and identify the places in the president's speech that were written by a Russian spy, right? So that is a real issue, but it's a covenant loyalties issue that you can actually deal with. And if what you start saying is anybody that group of people has these covenant loyalties, and I'm sure of it because of who they are, because you quote unquote who they are, well, then you're actually not dealing with reality anymore, because if you've got this is the Hollywood, this is the Hollywood question that I run into regularly, right? There's a great episode of Atlanta. I don't know if you guys watch Atlanta at all. It's a brilliantly written show. That's not me saying everything about it is perfect, but it's a brilliantly written show. And it's the show, one of the storylines is they're following an up and coming rapper out of Atlanta who's going international. And he keeps trying to find a black lawyer, right? He wants a black lawyer. I want a black lawyer. And his manager can't find a black entertainment lawyer. And he keeps saying, like, just don't get me a Jew. Just don't get me a Jew. It's really this funny running gag because he can only find Jewish entertainment lawyers. And so he finally, but he keeps getting, like, he gets screwed on every contract because his lawyers are all bad. And so finally he's like, okay, go get me a Jewish lawyer, right? It's just like, because but it's because he's like, I want somebody that will be loyal to my interests. And he keeps thinking that that's a skin color issue. And it's just a funny kind of running gag that, but we don't think in terms of, even with ourselves, we don't think in terms of covenant loyalties. Right. So it's the number of, very often, even as church communities, we don't have covenant loyalty towards our own city. We aren't willing to take our city's sin to the cross and ask for forgiveness, even though we're the priests of our city, right? We have a covenant connection to this place, these people, but we don't have the kinds of covenant loyalties that says, oh man, our city messed that one up. Lord, have mercy on us, the city of Spokane. Lord, have mercy on us. So our own covenant loyalties aren't strong. And so we have a hard time identifying whether other people's are or not. I mean, you can usually guarantee that if you're in Biden's cabinet, you don't have a lot of covenant loyalty to America, but
for sure.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, whether they're white or whatever they are, I mean, they're destroying the country. So,
right. Yeah.
I mean, there's plenty of white people who are doing a really good job destroying the country. I've got to go here in just a few minutes, but I wanted to bring up one other thing, and that is, if we were to take, we've talked about White Boy Summer, and obviously it's in some ways sort of this amorphous thing that just kind of exists on the internet. I don't know that it has any real existence outside of social media, but and we've talked about some negatives to it, and we've talked about some things about it maybe that are good. But if we were to reframe it in a better way, what might that look like? Let me throw something out to you, and you guys can both tell me what you think about this. Let's say instead of White Boy Summer, you had American Boy Summer, and that was the hashtag, and all the memes were created around American Boy Summer. Pros and cons to that.
I mean, the American flag swimsuits, that's a pro.
Yeah. I was rocking mine last week.
I want some American flag trunks.
Well, it's
Yeah,
not
I mean,
racial. It's not skin color anymore. So it could include blacks or so I mean, if White Boy Summer is at least in part supposed to be this celebration of white heritage, okay, American Boy Summer could therefore be a celebration of American heritage, okay. I mean, does something like that work? I mean, is it I'm not, I mean, there's probably
well,
no interest in it because it doesn't have the shock value that White Boy
right.
Summer has, right? I mean,
know.
that's why
I mean,
nobody's going to do
that's
it.
the problem.
I'm not really trying to suggest like a real marketing slogan here, or that anybody go make memes for this, because I don't think it's going to go anywhere. But thinking through, is there a way to would there be a way to capture what's good about White Boy Summer and jettison the problems with it?
Yeah. I think
I think I think what Jason points out that's good, and we should continue to call it good, is that there's an there's an effort to speak to the elephant in the room. Like you guys, mainstream media, progressives, whatever, are trying to scapegoat white people, and we reject that, and we want to thumb our nose at you. Like there's something about that I think is wonderful, and I agree with Jason. But it should be something that I think we can do that in a way that our Black, Hispanic, Asian, friends can all join in the celebration and join in the given the raspberry to the man, and not feel like, are these guys kind of like heading in a scary kinist racist direction, and I just feel like it looks and feels too much like the latter and not the former.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of truth in what you just said, and I think, I mean, if you're to take American Boy Summer, I think one thing that's interesting about that is, yes, it does open the door to people who don't have white skin who still want to celebrate America. Okay, and I think that's a good thing. The reality is, going back to the Stephen Wolf tweet, white evangelicals trying to save the country from white progressives. The reality is, I think whites, if they're going to actually, white evangelicals, if they're going to actually turn the ship of America in a different direction, they're going to need allies who are darker skinned. You're going to need the Clarence Thomases and so forth, who are part of that. I think that's the only way it's going to work. I think the other thing is, there is kind of this, there's been this reemergence of segregation, and you've seen this again on both sides. So you've got the progressives who want to create racially homogenous spaces, like these, sort of elitist, very progressive schools that had Black only graduation ceremonies, for example, no whites allowed, that kind of thing. Again, if you go, if you create a White Boy Summer and you're racially segregating along those lines, I think that's gonna be counterproductive. I think I don't think anything that's got white in the title of it is ever going to ultimately get very much traction in the broader culture. I mean, if you're really all about winning, which is what I think these guys seem to want, is they want to be winners. Putting white in the title of what you're trying to do is a losing proposition. It just is. It's never going to get very much traction. But I think the reality too is we need to reckon with the fact that historically there are many times where, in God's redemptive purposes or in the providence of God and his superintending of history, different ethnic groups have been brought together and blended in a way that really worked. I mean, it's the one time when I think you might be able to say diversity is our strength. I mean, the Anglo-Saxon race is a hyphenated race. Okay. Mm-hmm. Anglo-Saxons are a hyphenated people.
And we forgot the Jutes too, because it was the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes originally. Nobody even remembers the Jutes.
Hyphenated even more. The very fact that Europe became a thing, like that, right, Europe became an identifiable people, was due to the fact that the gospel really could knit together these different, I mean, these are people that in their pagan days, I mean, they obviously got subdued by Rome to a degree, but then they also caused the downfall of Rome. And all these different people groups, they were just at war with each other. They just fought against each other. And it was the gospel that transformed them so that they could become a coherent people and they could function as a common civilization, even though they still had various, you could say, ethnic particularities when it comes to language or architecture or music or diet and so forth. But I mean, I remember, he's Roman Catholic, but I still think it makes an interesting point. Hilaire Belloc said, Europe is the faith. Like, if you want to know it, and of course, he wouldn't say that today, but if you want to know what the Christian faith looks like in its full flower, he said, look at Europe at its highest point. That's Christian civilization. That's the Christian faith in action. And not only is that civilization beautiful, with all the beautiful architecture and so forth, but it was also unified across ethnic lines. And of course, that didn't last. When it secularized, they went to war with each other. You could even say in the wake of the Reformation, some of that started to break down because there was a division of faith. But for a long time, you had a coherent civilization that was tied together by a faith. And so you had, and of course, you go to the New Testament and you see that Gentiles and Jews who believed in Jesus were being knitted together into a common people. So whatever we want to say about preserving ethnicity and the importance of celebrating your own heritage, celebrating your own people group, however you want to define that, you have to have room in that for the kind of thing Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 2, where Jew and Gentile are brought together as one new man. And I think that's really, really a crucial thing that I think is being lost in a lot of the current discussions. It's like, to me, it's something that's very much at odds with the New Testament. So we have to have that. Of course, you have America, which at her best has been a nation that also blended together. And you can say, oh, they all came from Northern Europe. But see, right there, you're kind of cheating because they still came from different nations and different ethnicities. And of course, they all did want to assimilate. That's part of what made America work well for so long. They wanted to become Americans. But you also at times had tensions with, say, the Irish or the Italians, people who didn't necessarily feel welcomed at first, who had to kind of carve out their niche, and then they got integrated into the nation. But again, because America was largely a Christian nation, there's that shared Christian heritage, it could happen. So I think we have to do away with this idea that, oh, the people groups are so different from one another, they can never be, in any way sort of reconciled or brought together. That's just not true. And we've got the Bible and we've got history that show us that's not the case. And so I think that Christians, while yes, we should celebrate, as you put it, Jason, our covenantal groupings. It's fine to celebrate a covenantal lineage of which you're a part, whether that's your city's lineage or your state or your nation or your family or your tribe. That's wonderful to celebrate that. But I think you also have to be open to the fact that all of those various identities are permeable by people who have different backgrounds. If you're being faithful, they're going to be permeable to some degree. And we can talk about the degree to which they should be permeable, but there's got to be some kind of permeability there. And the question would be, well, how permeable can they be while you still maintain your identity? How many people of different ethnicities could move to a particular city without that city losing what made that city what it was? That's a great question to ask. And I think that's a prudential question. I think there's a way of dealing with that. But
well, it's like
I would just say a family group or a city or a nation that will, it's almost like a form of incest, like cultural incest. We're only going to have dealings with our own. And I think that's you can there's a ditch on both sides here. And I think we have to make sure that we avoid it. And I think if we're faithful to the New Testament, to what it talks about with the incorporation of the Gentiles and Jews into one fellowship, if we're faithful to the fifth commandment to honor our fathers and mothers who have gone before us, if we're faithful in all these ways, I think we can achieve the right balance. But we've got to recognize there's a ditch on both sides.
Yeah, it's a good word, Rich. I feel like we all have a lot more things we want to talk about because this is such a fascinating topic and such a relevant topic right now. Jason, I'll give you why don't you give us the final word here, and we'll close it out.
I say we just start celebrating Capitalist Boy Summer. I think that's the real solution.
Yes.
I was thinking like, let's celebrate diligent boy summer or confident boy summer, skilled boy summer, like.
That sounds pretty beta. All those sound really beta.
The former boy summer.
Former boy summer. Yeah.
I once was a boy summer.
And when do these boys become men? Do they ever?
Yeah.
Well, I do think like I think about the place my mind goes to on a lot of this stuff as we kind of wrap up is I actually think Tolkien and Lewis were really hitting on this stuff really well when Jason was talking about elite, like who do you pledge your allegiance to, like who are you loyal to? That's really what we're talking about, and it's a covenantal thing, and it's something that I think is glorious and beautiful when you see it done right. It's just amazing, I mean, it brings a tear to your eye to see Reepicheep and Duffleput, or just the different characters from these completely different places who all are united in their allegiance to the king, and we all know what that looks like. In the South, it's your allegiance to Auburn versus Alabama versus LSU. I mean, that transcends everything. I mean, like if we're talking about your loyalty to your sports team, your football team, that transcends everything. I mean, my kid may not be a Christian, but they'll always be an Auburn fan. They may. It's like so. It's like I think we get how this thing is supposed to work. I think just we find ourselves in a very odd moment in American history where we're having to recapitulate, sort of the basic message of equality, or what it's not equality. I mean, it's not equality isn't the answer. It's just it's unity under Christ. It's mutual submission to Christ. It's justification in Christ. And I think that's what it's weird, because I feel like these were things that, like Rich said, were understood in our culture not that long ago, and have just, as Jason pointed out so well, the guilt manipulators of our age have really introduced this lever of race and identity politics to drive a wedge and control and steer our country. And I just think, like, the point we're all trying to make here is that there's a real danger of the white boy summer thing being used by those who actually want to destroy all vestiges of Christianity, in our nation, and they're adding fuel to the fire, unfortunately. Well, guys,
Jason, thanks for coming on, talking with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for your essay.
Yes. Yeah, we'll have to have you on again, sir. Keep writing good stuff, and we'll get articles in the show notes to Jason's article, to Rich's colorblind article, and you guys send me anything else you want me to put in there. It's great having you.
Thanks for having me.
Conversation. All right. We'll see ya.
See ya.
All right.
The God a Minute podcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you like this podcast, you might enjoy one of our other podcasts, The Good Life Podcast, featuring Matt Carpenter interviewing experts in their field about how their work contributes to the good life.